This is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Damian Farrow, Professor of Skill Acquisition at Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia. Hi everyone, welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Damian Farrow. Damian received his PhD from the University of Queensland. After serving for a few years as the first ever skill acquisition specialist in the Australian Institute of Sport, he now holds a joint position with AIS and Victoria University. So he's both conducting research on skill acquisition and applying these ideas directly with athletes. In the interview, we take a step-by-step look at practice design, discussing how to determine the goals of practice, how to effectively manipulate constraints, how to achieve the right balance of practice variability, how to effectively use instruction and feedback, and things an athlete should do when off the practice field. Hope you enjoy!
Not 10 years ago, I was a child. I was a good boy and you let me go. Now I'm on a talk show.
Today my guest is Damian Farrow, Professor of Skill Acquisition at Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Damian.
My pleasure, Rob.
So to kick things off, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in sports science?
Sure. I actually did a physical education degree to start with, and like probably all students, I had a part-time job, and mine was I was a tennis coach. And as I did my phys ed degree and as I coached tennis more and more, I started to realise the lack of impact I was having on my students. So I was getting a bit concerned about that. And so I ended up doing this unit called Skill Acquisition, and I thought, this is what I need to be applying more in my coaching. And so I got more interested in skill acquisition. Once finishing my phys ed degree, I ended up doing a master's that looked at contextual interference, and then did a bit of teaching in the university system and ended up then doing my PhD in expertise. And then from there, ended up at the Australian Institute of Sport I'm still there. So I was there for a decade full time, and I've been there for the last 7 years in this current joint role that I have with Victoria Uni. So it just sort of lined up based on the coaching experiences that I was having and my interest in the field. And then as I went along, it was interesting that there was a real need and an interest in this field within Australia, certainly in terms of coaches looking for support. And so hence that's where the AIS role sort of came from, that they identified a gap that I could fill for them.
That's great. And you now have kind of a joint role, right? You're, I think what Dave Collins' word would be pracademic, doing both the research and working directly with teams and athletes, right?
That's right. That's a great description, actually. So I'm employed by Victoria University in their Institute for Sport, Exercise and Active Living. And I supervise, I think I have about half a dozen PhD students and a few postdocs that I'm supervising. And so that's the research side of the job. And then half my time with the Australian Institute of Sport, most of that time is spent with the Australian swimming team. So looking at how we practice in that setting and advising coaches, working with other sports science providers to give them background and content in that particular area. So that's the applied side of my job. So it's a really nice balance. I don't think I could do one or the other anymore. I really see that I have to be like this to really have some sort of translational impact with any of the research work that we might do.
So for the main topic I wanted to talk to you about today, of course, there's tons of things we could talk about, but I wanted to focus on practice design, kind of going through all the main issues kind of step by step. And so to start off, let's talk a little bit about defining the goals of practice. So a lot of people talk about the difference between performance and learning. So, how do you think practice should differ when our goal is learning a skill versus when our goal is maybe just improving the performance of that skill?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Rob. The first point I'd make is that I think my experience is many coaches don't even tease apart that focus, that practice goal of whether it is performance or learning. So I think one of the things is actually educating them around the differences there with performance and learning. But once we do have that understood, the simple way that I try and talk to my coaches is that obviously we're not going to make a wholesale change or a learning change to a performer somewhat close to a competition event. We've basically got to go into that event with whatever level of skill and whatever technical qualities that they already have. And so for me, the key thing there is to provide practice opportunities that really inflate the confidence levels of the athlete going into that event so that they at least perform to the best of their capacity with confidence. So for me, that's more of if you're on that continuum of variability, it's a little bit more of the blocked or really just letting the athlete select themselves about how much repetition of a particular skill they feel they need to do to be ready to compete. So for me, it's very much around that at the performance end, whereas at the learning end, we can be far more aggressive in the amount of variability and challenges and the variety of constraints that we might throw at the athlete.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And then, yeah, I guess one way to think about it is how good do you want to look in practice, right? If you're learning, maybe struggling and not looking so good is what you should be aiming for versus performing well, getting ready for a competition.
Absolutely. We talk about that a lot. Learning is messy is our little mantra. Mm-hmm. And so we're really comfortable if training looks messy. And I think, again, a key observation I've made over the years is just that you've just got to take the coaches and the athletes on that journey in terms of them understanding that it is okay for training to look messy. There'll be times where the ball won't go cleanly to your teammate or whatever it may be, and that's okay. That's all part of the learning process. And I think that's one of our greatest challenges is highlighting to athletes and coaches about, well, what you're doing today, you mightn't see the benefits of this type of practice for some period of time afterwards. And so measuring learning is always a challenge in terms of getting that immediacy of feedback that coaches and athletes are always craving.
Yeah, and in research too. So one of the things related to this I've kind of heard you talk about is the difference between training to improve technique versus training to improve skill. So can you talk a little bit about what, that difference between technique and skill in your mind?
Yeah. Ultimately, I don't think there should be too much of a difference at all between the two. But the reality of, again, what happens in the applied setting is that quite often coaches will want to change a movement pattern. And they'll often do that in a context where they're really decoupling that technique from how it might actually be used in the performance context. And so we would call that very much technique training. And we really talk to the coaches a lot about there's probably a limit to the amount of that type of work that you really want to be doing because you're really not, obviously, from our point of view, the connection to the performance setting and to all the other sources of information that are going to be important in informing a performance are obviously not present most of the time. So, and that's where I start talking to them about skill, that essentially skill is that ability to apply a given technique, whatever that is, at the right time in the right circumstance. So to me, skill is being adaptable, being able to adapt that technique to the context, being able to handle the various levels of pressure that you might be exposed to and still meet your task goal, whatever that may be.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to describe it. And I know there's been a lot of debate about that recently. The example of technique drills seem to be dribbling around cones in soccer, right? But a lot of people are starting to attack or challenge that value of that. So
yeah, I can see why it's happened as a tradition, and I can see where we probably want to get to. And like all good debates, you take extreme positions, and probably the solution lies somewhere in the middle, and we'll probably end up talking about that later.
Mm-hmm. And I guess last, in terms of goals, what are your thoughts on, quantity versus quality of practice? I'm guessing, the idea of doing just banging out reps and reps and reps in terms of quantity is probably not the best way to go in your view.
That's true. Yeah, I'd rather us really try and focus a little bit more on quality. Having said that, the goal of practice comes into play here, so I think that's an important thing to consider. But what I notice quite often is what we just call it headless practice, where you're accruing a significant number of repetitions on a given skill, but the amount of investment that the athlete is putting into that execution is quite low. And so hence the learning value, if you like, of that repetition, I think is quite minimal as a consequence. We see that and certainly working in swimming as a sport, they're notorious for a large amount of quantity and quite often at the expense of quality. And so I think again, everything's a continuum, and there's times where you do need to knock up a significant amount of volume. But equally, my argument is that I think if you do it well and you organise the practice in such a manner that you're gaining as much as possible from each repetition, you can afford to do less. And I certainly know that my colleagues in physiotherapy and rehabilitation and those sort of disciplines are really pleased when we're able to say, well, we can get a skill outcome with reduced repetition, because that makes their job a little bit easier when it comes to overuse injuries and the like.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I probably can link it back to what we were talking about with looking good in practice, right? You know, I know there's a lot of research that when you look at what athletes do, they like to do the things they're already good at in practice a lot. Yeah. So do you see the same kind of things? I guess also coaches like to see athletes looking good too. So it's probably both sides, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we do get a lot of that where, you know, we often talk about the fact that if you think of a team sport, whether it's a soccer or a football or whatever it may be, we're often challenging the coaches that, you know, what they've just showed us is, you know, akin to some sort of dance routine or ballet routine, that it just runs off and it looks so pretty. But, you know, do the players actually understand why they're running where they're running, and are they actually meeting the task goal? Do they actually even know what the task goal is and why they're running this particular pattern? So that tends to get their attention, and we can then have a bit more of a conversation about it's not a bad thing to practice a little bit more messy.
Okay. Yeah, so now maybe turning from the goals of practice to how to practice, what's kind of your overall philosophy about practice design?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm saying the right thing here as an academic, but from a pracademic's point of view, my philosophy is I'm not wedded to one particular theoretical perspective on this. So I really enjoy using a constraints learning approach, and I find that to be a really effective framework to work with coaches on how we go about thinking about what the task goal is, being creative in looking for ways to influence athlete performance and their learning, and that there's a lot of benefits in that constraints-led approach in terms of the coach being more of a facilitator than the direct instruction, the athlete having to do more of this learning for themselves, if you like, the implicit learning concepts, etc. So obviously that constraints-led approach is very much embedded within a ecological dynamics framework. But equally, I'm equally interested in just looking at the concepts of specificity. And I know an ecological perspective might talk about it in terms of representativeness, and we can really get hung up on the words here and their meaning. And I know they have very different connotations, but when I'm dealing with a coach, coaches tend to understand what specificity means. And so my language really just represents what they'll understand. And so for me, it's around organising constraints to create specific situations or representative situations that are going to influence the skill most effectively. And I think probably that's my philosophy in general terms. And then it's really around, I think the challenge is being creative to scale the practice context to the level of skill of the athletes that you're dealing with. And so quite often coaches think you can only use constraints when you get with higher level performers. And so it's really an education process there around how you can scale back a task through, you know, manipulating the number of defenders that might be in a game situation, or or changing the ball type that you use to slow the game down, but maintaining the integrity of the key perception-action relationships that are going to occur in the game. So for me, yeah, I'm a little bit, I don't know if that's theoretical, but I'll sample whatever I think's most appropriate to get the outcome that I think is most relevant.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people end up doing in practice. I think you're right. And I think that's a really good point about the constraints-led approach. And I know a lot of people are buying into this, but I don't know if a lot of people understand. It's not just randomly changing the rules of practice, right? It has to be systematic with the goal of getting people kind of attuned to something or picking up something in the environment, right? Can you talk a little bit about how you do that more specifically and maybe how you change it systematically?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good point. And so the first thing I'll say is that constraints-based coaching, I think, is a really high-level coaching skill if you do it well. So it's more difficult than, running off a recipe book from some sort of skills and drills manual. So the process that we go through is we bring a coach in and we actually get them to develop what we just call a constraints table or a constraints matrix. So we'll think about a particular skill and we'll basically go, okay, how can we develop this skill further? What are some of the things that we could change or that you've used in the past to change an outcome that you're looking for? So if we were manipulating, if it was around a ball movement pattern in a team sport, we might talk to them about, well, what happens when you play 4-on-5 rather than 5-on-5? What are the typical things that you've noticed in your experience? And we try and then get them to position, so they'll start generating a whole lot of different constraints ideas. And we might do it where we're focused on task, environment, person, or often we don't really care about the label. We just throw them all on the table. Then we try and put them in some sort of progression order. And then once we have that progression order, that sort of starts to take the shape of a matrix. And then the coaches can start to apply these things with a little bit more confidence and know that, well, if I play a 5-on-3 game, these are the typical behaviours I get to see. If I narrow the field so it's really long and narrow, I'll tend to see ball movement being, more longer and direct. So if that's the outcome I'm looking for, I know I can start at this game, or there's a progression before or after that I could go to. So we end up developing these constraints tables, and we've found that to be the most effective way to then apply the concepts quite systematically.
Yeah, that sounds really good. And I guess it gives them a good idea too when they can move to another drill when they're seeing the outcomes that are the goals of these different. Yeah, that's really nice. Turning to another kind of thing we always talk about, and you mentioned this a bit earlier on about variability of practice. And, kind of everybody accepts that variability is a good thing in practice. But can you talk a little bit more about how you achieve kind of that balance between blocked versus random practice?
Yeah, to me, it's a fascinating area. So I think you said it, everyone sort of accepts that variability is good, but then it's just a matter of how variable we want to make things. And so my starting point is I talk to people about the two extremes, and then I really have a soft spot for the win, shift, lose, stay approach. So it's basically performance contingent switching almost. So essentially, the classic example, we have a schoolyard game here called Round the World, a basketball game. And you basically move around the key. If you make a successful basketball shot, you move to the next marking on the key. And if you get it in, you move again. But if you miss the shot, you have to stay where you are. And so we talk to coaches and athletes a lot about that game is essentially win, shift, lose, stay. And to me, that's about developing an appropriate level of variability for your given level of performance. So it actually helps you individualize that concept a little bit. So we do spend a lot of time thinking about how to do that. And it mightn't be just around an outcome. It might be to do with a movement pattern or a component of a movement. And I think that's the way I would try and conceptualize things more than anything else. The other point I'll make is that what we're noticing more and more is the complexity of the skills, certainly at the high performance level. If an athlete's making a change, we are finding that we are stripping back the amount of variability more than we would have thought, just to get some sort of coherence in the movement pattern before we progress them on. So being a really strong advocate for high variability, I've had to scale back my expectations sometimes.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. You want to make sure you don't move on before they kind of got the skill, some aspect of it anyway. And that winning and moving is kind of a good way to think about it. So if you're going to use a constraints-led approach and do these different things, I think one of the really tricky parts for a coach when you're doing this is when to step in with instructions and feedback. So can you talk a little bit about what you think a coach's role should be in terms of giving feedback and instruction, and maybe, how should the athlete be involved in deciding how this is done and when it's done?
Yeah, I mean, that brings up a range of topics there. It's really interesting. And so this is where I suppose if you look at the literature, the really controlled literature around things like self-controlled learning and self-controlled feedback, what we find is it really depends on the athlete a little bit. So we'll have athletes that if you gave them the opportunity, they would be looking for, whether it's some sort of video feedback that we might have after a repetition on a feedback loop, they'd be wanting to sample that every single repetition, and almost leading to over analysis and overthinking of what they're trying to achieve. So first thing is we really get to know what the athlete's tendencies are, and then we balance that out with what we think is appropriate. So for us, we are really trying to develop the athletes to drive their own learning. And so we do want the coach to stand back and not intervene, which traditionally they'd be intervening probably what we consider to be too often. So what we tell the coaches to do is really focus on finding the level of practice challenge where after a period of stretch, they get some degree of consistency in performance. And as soon as they see consistency in performance, you can provide them some positive feedback there, but then you need to ramp up the challenge. And so keep them somewhat destabilized and don't let them settle too much into a preferred pattern at that point. So for us, it's about looking at current execution and also being cognizant of the athlete's level of confidence. Are they getting really despondent from the challenge? It's too hard. And so you're losing their motivation or engagement to want to make the change. So there's that, in a way, there's an art to that, I think, as much as a science. But we're really trying to balance those two needs of maintaining athlete confidence, letting them think they're in control of the learning process by driving when they request feedback, how many extra repetitions of a skill they might want to do. That's where we empower the coach to say, well, you can still intervene here. You can still ask them to do more practice than potentially what the athlete wants to do. So there's a lot of science underpinning those questions that is in the literature. I sometimes wonder about how applicable or generalizable that literature currently is in the actual, certainly in a high performance setting where you're dealing with really engaged athletes they'll do anything to improve, and they can actually, in so doing, they can actually disrupt their learning by trying too hard, if you like, or wanting too much information. So we're really trying to balance those needs.
Yeah, and I think that you have a really good point. Is a lot of the laboratory tasks, these things are based on are incredibly boring things that you have to do over and over for an hour and a half or something. So you're right; it's very different than a highly motivated athlete. That's this is their life. So I think that's a good point.
I think one thing I did pick up that I find really useful, and I can't remember the paper that sort of highlighted this to me or the papers, but that often we're catching athletes and giving them feedback when they've performed poorly or when they've made an error outside of a bandwidth that we think's appropriate, as opposed to catching them doing it well. And I think certainly high performance athletes, unlike probably many people in their professions, they get analysed more than everyone else. They're always constantly being scrutinised. So to actually flip the feedback and give them positive feedback, I think, is quite a nice way to get that level of engagement, and you end up getting the same result quite often.
Yeah, no, I think that is a really robust finding. Yeah, most athletes know when they did really poorly. You don't need to tell them, right? So
Correct.
Also, in terms of feedback, in almost every sport you can think of now, we have these complex analytics, right? We can give you feedback about velocity, all these different things now. How much, in your opinion, should we be giving that back to the athlete, if at all?
Yeah, I'm very reticent to give much to the athlete at all. The old KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid, I think is a really valuable thing to keep in mind with feedback. So the two things I see all the time are exactly what you're talking about, Rob. You get all these programs that you can measure the nth degree of their performance in terms of whether it's a kinematic or some sort of kinetic measure. The irony is that a lot of that is probably outside of their level of control anyway. So why give them feedback about something they can't control? And then the other key feature that you see in most new feedback devices is that you can provide it in real time. And again, I go, well, that's a claim that they're wanting to promote, whereas I see that as a negative most of the time, in that we're really, if we want the athletes to take control of their learning and skill performance, you really want them having to generate the feedback before anyone augments it or provides it to you. So we're very careful to turn those functions off a lot of the time. And then it goes to my point earlier that we have a lot of athletes, because they are so invested, they'll drill into the nth degree of this information if we gave it to them, which I think just opens up a raft of other problems. So we'll certainly share it with a coach, but I think the skill of good coaches and good skill acquisition practitioners is to be able to take those numbers and turn it into a really simple analogy or cue that means something to the athlete, or let the athlete do that. But yeah, I'm very reticent to overuse the data.
Yeah, no, I agree. I've seen, it's a good way to make an athlete really hesitant and no overthinking if you give him too much. Yeah. So I guess the final kind of stage of practice I want to talk about is what the athlete does when they're off the field. There are lots of things we could talk about. I guess, what is your take on the kind of diversification versus specialization of sports? Should they be playing other sports and doing other things?
Yeah, so it's a hot topic that you don't have to look far to see. So there's a reality there that I'm very much an advocate for the diversification. Now, I get that if you're going to become a gymnast, you're probably not going to diversify too much, and there's not much we can do about that. But many of our team sports, I think the evidence is certainly reasonable that you can still become elite with a diversified background. And the key point is, sadly, I see just as many, when they get to an institute level of performer, you see just as many athletes that don't make it as you do who make it. And so those that have come from that over-specialized approach tend to be the ones that struggle a little bit more in that transition out of sport. So I think from an ethical point of view, I think the diversification is also a really nice thing to do. I think there's value in it in terms of you can actually be really strategic about it. And I know that there's research groups that would argue that it's more about early engagement. So you might play football, but you also play futsal or street soccer or whatever it is. So that's somewhere in between, I suppose. And I think that's the reality if you're going to be an elite performer in some of these highly competitive team sports. The individual sports here in Australia at the moment, we're really changing the structure of our swimming programs, because we're seeing more and more athletes or children being trained as high performance athletes at 10 and 11 years of age. And you never see them making a national team because they're burned out and they're done. But our current competition structure probably encourages that behaviour from coaches and parents. So as an organisation, swimming's had to make some changes there, which they've just done recently, which I hope will lead to a bit of a de-emphasis on that specialisation and overtraining and not diversifying. So, yes, I have a fairly strong view on it. And from a skill point of view, I think it's reasonable. Obviously, if you adopt a more direct interpretation of deliberate practice, well, you're wasting deliberate practice opportunity. But, yeah, I'm sort of comfortable with that position.
The other off the field thing I wanted to kind of ask about your opinion is kind of some of these other, you talked about specificity. some of these kind of more general training things that are popping up more and more, using video of yourself doing computer-based tasks, even up to lots of VR things coming out now. What are kind of your thoughts of the value of those?
Yeah, that's a real area of interest. There's two parts to that. So the video training can be in a number of formats. It can be reviewing of performance. It can be some sort of turned into some sort of computer game where you're trying to get athletes to make decisions like they would in a game. I've been an advocate for that type of practice, but the evidence isn't that strong to support it as yet. And I think partly that's been a research design issue. But equally, I also think we haven't necessarily scheduled that practice appropriately. So for me, the key mantra I talk to our coaches about is if we are going to do any of this type of decoupled video-based type training, yes, get the athletes making proactive decisions that rather than just reflecting on a decision, but schedule physical practice immediately after that. So you can somehow go out and reconnect what you've been learning on the video with actual performance. Often that doesn't happen. It's prescribed and they're looking at a series of maybe, you're an attacker in a game, so you're looking at all these attacking situations. And then if you actually go and train that afternoon, you don't even do those attack plays. So for me, there has to be that connection back to the physical performance if you're going to use it. The other area that's got a lot of interest is multiple object tracking paradigm, where it's non-sport specific, but the proponents of it would argue that there is a lot of sport specificity in the way that you have to do the multiple object tracking. I thought it was a dead issue within the field, but it certainly had a strong resurgence. And so we're starting to see research come out. And on some occasions, the research is sort of somewhat supportive of this type of training. So for me, I thought it was a dead duck. I'll probably keep thinking it is till I'm proved otherwise with some of this more recent evidence. And I'm yet to see the key question that none of the researchers really attacked well enough, whether it's video, sport-specific video, VR, or multiple object tracking, is the appropriate transfer testing, showing where these changes are manifesting themselves in actual performance. I think that's the big challenge that we've got ahead there. We can't say don't do it because it probably won't hurt you, but it might waste a bit of your time. And if time's precious, it'd be one of the last things I'm recommending. I think we can do a lot more effective work on the field or court before we need to worry about some of these off-field activities.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great summary of the way things stand, and amen about the need for the good transfer research. So I guess the last question I have for you, Damian, is can you tell us a bit about what you're currently working on or planning in the near future?
Yeah, sure. So we have a range of people within the group doing a range of different things. Probably one of the weaknesses of my research is that because of the nature of the employment that I have, I'm answering questions in a range of areas. So we do have a student at the moment looking at some of these off-court activities, the perceptual training area, looking at using some VR, and that's in the sport of tennis. And we're trying to reconcile a decent transfer test. So we're playing in that space. We're also doing a lot of work at the moment in terms of, earlier in the year with a colleague, I wrote a paper around periodizing skill acquisition. There was nothing new in that at all. It was really just a framework that we've found really useful for engaging coaches. But now what we're trying to do is provide some nice systematic evidence for each one of those areas. So we have various students and so forth looking into, concepts of overload or whatever it might be, and what are the key constraints that we can overload to get a learning effect. And we're situating that within some of our high performance programs where we can do this work over a period of time rather than the more traditional, short, sharp, laboratory-based sort of intervention. So there are a couple of things that are sort of certainly high on my list at the moment. And then probably the final one would be we've got a number of projects around what we call talent tracking. So there's a number of groups around the world that are doing this type of work where we're really just systematically observing longitudinally how talent in a particular sport develops. What are the qualities of a performer that are most important at what stage of development? And really, sport is very interested in that because it can then inform their coach education and preparation programs.
That all sounds really good. And I know the periodization I hear that coming up more and more. So I really look forward to seeing that. So this has been great. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Damian.
My pleasure, Rob. Keep up the great work.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Damian. I look forward to hearing about the transfer of training and periodization research you mentioned. You can find out more about Damian from the links in the show notes. Coming soon on the Perception in Action podcast, a new segment looking at innovative video feedback for correcting technique, team coordination in baseball, and how affordances guide our movements. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.
Cut you quick.